Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. And the first of the new year as well. A good time to get back to basics and look at one of the humbler aspects of the 41st millennium. A pillar of the community, if you will. A pillar of the professional eating community, at least. The Tyranid Gaunts. But first, a word from our sponsor. Are you interested in mythology, gods and demigods, heroes and monsters of myth? Well, there just so happens to be a PvP and PvE game available right now with just such characters. One of which is available right now for free. Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. A figment of far more recent mythology than the likes of Zeus and the bunch. Yet the Chinese monarch of the monkeys has still been around for 400 odd years, and his origins may be more ancient still. His enduring popularity no doubt due to his abundance of superpowers, many of which are reflected in-game. His magical staff, weighing in at a manageable 17,000 pounds, for example, inflicts a minus 50% defense modifier on hit. And all surplus damage dealt to a defeated foe spreads to the rest of them. He can also steal enemy buffs and block debuffs from being placed on his team. And even should the Monkey King fall, his all-powerful passive ability will resurrect him right back to life again. And he is free in-game right now for new players with the promo code Monkey King. In other Raid Shadow Legends news, the Cursed City is Raid's biggest new feature since the Doom Tower. With 100 encounters to clear, there is plenty to play with, including double boss battles against 2 massive enemies. Collect countless awards along the way and finally reach the center of the city. And if you join up now, you can also take part in Raid's Christmas event, with all sorts of themed events, tournaments, summon booths, and other surprises, with a month-long Yuletide Titan event where you can earn awesome in-game rewards. So what are you waiting for? Go check out Raid Shadow Legends and cozy up in Terraria this holiday season. Check out the link in the description below or scan the QR code on screen. And as a new player, you will get 2 epic heroes, Lightsworn and Juliana. And of course, don't forget the promo code Monkey King. You'll find all of these rewards in-game here in your inbox. Now, on with the lore. This adorable little organism suffers the same fate as so many other foot sloggers across the 41st millennium. As the Imperial Guardsman is compared to the Space Marine, as the Fire Warrior is compared to the dashing Crisis Battlesuit Pilot, as the effeminate Guardian is compared to the Exarch, so are the Gaunts compared to Hive Tyrants, to Carnifexes, to Warriors, and towering Bio-Titans. But an equally inimicable truth is the pure and simple fact that without the resplendent ranks of simple foot soldiers, the almighty specialists would have no one to show off to. For after all, what is a Hive Tyrant with no army to lead? What is a Carnifex, a mighty battering ram without strong arms with which to bring it to the gate? What are warriors, the commandos of the Tyranid species, without front lines to return to? What even is a Bio-Titan without a carpet of little critters to protect its vulnerable underbelly? But, in sharp contrast to most armies in the far-flung future, the Tyranid species is, well, pretty much defined by its ability to adapt to any and all circumstances, to any and all environments, and any and all foe. Thus, the base must be as adaptable as the whole, making the Gaunt the probably single most versatile basic grunt trooper in the entirety of 40k. Boasting as they do dozens of variants, mostly focused around particular weapons or niche roles on the battlefield, like the Barb Gaunt, for example, which is a lighter, more mobile variant of the Biowar artillery platform. Or the hyper-specialized Neuro Gaunts, serving, in effect, as radio men for the Tyranid army. And if we were to get into the weeds on all of their variations, we'd be here for a while, so let us instead focus on the three main variants of Gaunts: the Hormagaunt, the Termagant, and the Gargoyle. But in keeping with today's theme, let us start with the most mundane of the three, the Hormagaunt. This is a close-quarters combat specialized version of the basic Gaunt. It's also usually the most numerous form of creature deployed by the Tyranid hive fleet in orbit, to the point where it is not only usually the first combatant into action against the enemy, but also the very first bioorganism to die at the hands, or more correctly and usually, the flak of the enemy. As the very first strategic purpose the Hormagaunts are put to is to die in vast quantities aboard mycetic spore pods in the initial invasion proceedings. As the average Tyranid invasion will begin with the hive fleet itself moving into low orbit over the victim world, after which each individual ship will deploy billions of mycetic spore pods, 99% of which will contain Hormagaunts or Termagants. This is done to completely blanket the enemy's anti-air and orbital defenses, in effect neutralizing them by providing them with so many targets that not only can they not shoot all of them down, but it will be impossible to pick out the slightly larger spore pods containing warriors or hive tyrants from the trillion other spore pods containing de facto worthless Gaunts. It's a pretty brutal strategy, but an effective one, and the Hormagaunts have never complained. Not that they're biologically capable of complaining, as they lack the simple mental faculties to even understand that they're being used as worthless chaff, but hey, details. And besides, they're pretty used to it by now, as the Hormagaunts' primary role, that being cannon fodder, doesn't really change over much even when they do, by some hellish miracle, make it to the ground, where their very first course of action is to lay eggs. Yes. And on that note, you will excuse me a brief little side tangent, because you see, the other type of Gaunt that we are going to be talking about today is the Termagant. Now, it just so happens that Termagant is an old-timey English word for woman. Well, specifically an annoying woman, but potato, potato. Thus, it is in fact canonically correct to say that the Tyranids invade planets by pelting them with pregnant women. And people complain that the Warhammer 40,000 universe doesn't have enough representation. Anyhow, back to the Hormagaunts. The purpose of the egg-laying is to replace the astronomically high casualty rates amongst the first wave of invaders. The eggs themselves grow extraordinarily quickly, and by the time the first wave of Hormagaunts have been annihilated, the next batch should be ready to hatch, and able to re-engage the enemy with another wave of little stabby bastards. The reason why they don't simply drop more Hormagaunts down onto the planet is because the rate of attrition is pretty goddamn high, even by Tyranid standards, as the mycetic spores, although somehow able to, survive the rigors of orbital entry, are quite fragile and will be blown apart in their thousands by any sort of organized anti-aerial defenses. Thus, obviously, being able to produce the second wave on site is immensely advantageous. Furthermore, every time the Hive fleet needs to deploy another orbital invasion, they are placing far more at risk than the Hormagaunts themselves, as the Hive ships will need to enter and stay in low orbit for an extended period of time whilst deploying their spore pods, placing them at tremendous risk from enemy anti-orbital defenses. And due to the rigors and dangers of low orbit, even hits that would normally merely wound a ship could be fatal in low orbit, and losing an entire Hive ship is equivalent to losing billions of Gaunts. So yeah, the whole second wave on-planet approach is quite clever, and allows the first wave to go about its business with the surety of purpose of those who know that they've left many adorable little children behind to carry on their objectives. Now, as for exactly what the Hormagaunts do on the planet, well, here's the clever part yet again. Unlike many Tyranid organisms, the Hormagaunts don't necessarily require continuous guidance. Not that they're intelligent like the warriors or high Tyranids, mind you, oh god no. They are simply hyper-predatory. The supercharged biology of the Hormagaunt will literally kill it in mere hours of its arrival. And so, in a desperate attempt to keep itself fed and alive, the Hormagaunts' natural instincts will see them swarm across the planet to find and eat anything they can get their little jaws on. This will of course result in significant collateral damage, but not like the Hive fleet cares, it's all food anyways, and as a fortuitous side effect of this maddened feeding frenzy, the Hormagaunts will, as a indirect result rather than a real aim of their actions, begin mapping out the positions of enemy formations. Wherever the casualty rates are the highest, well, that's where the Hive fleet knows that there are bad guys around, allowing the fleet to redirect its specialists to the area. First and foremost, to figure out exactly what is there, and whether or not it is valuable enough to begin rerouting second wave Hormagaunts onto the target. The target priorities of the first strike is fairly obvious: to make sure that there can be a second and a third strike, namely enemy anti-aircraft silos, massed defenses, and first and foremost, orbital defense batteries. Now, these will usually be heavily fortified, as, well, the fate of the entire planet rests upon their continued operation, and in many cases they will be nestled deep within massive defensive structures or huge civilian complexes, like Hive cities for example, meaning that a handful of Hormagaunts ain't going to be overrunning it anytime soon. But in the case of mobile AAA batteries, or flak cannons, or even those placed on minor bases or barracks compounds, well, a second wave swell of a few 100,000 Hormagaunts might very well be able to overrun that. And as centers of enemy resistance are identified and subsequently, preferably, neutralized, the Hive fleet will be able to pick and choose its targets for future reinforcements. It is a vital task, but a very dangerous one, and it makes the Hormagaunts the second most expendable category of organism within the Hive fleet, with the first being flesh borers, you know, the living ammunition that lives inside of Tyranid weaponry. The Hormagaunts are only slightly less expendable than actual literal ammunition, and this is the reason for their fairly simplistic biological makeup. The Hormagaunt is in essence nothing more than a pair of claws and a jaw, and a means of locomotion. In other words, the ability to stab the enemy and the ability to hopefully find and catch the enemy. Nothing fancy, nothing frilly. Of course, there are exceptions with more specialized variants, but in that case we would be wandering somewhat off the point, now wouldn't we? And there are occasionally some adjustments made on the fly, all to enhance the two previous abilities whilst remaining as cheap to produce as possible. as that again is the primary purpose of the Hormagaunt, to be the mass of the hive, not to really be its killers. Say, for example, if the planet has extreme climate hazards. In the case of extreme colds or extreme heat, this might require some adjustments. If the planet is an ocean world, well, then the first wave is going to drown. As the Tyranids are not very good at judging things before they happen. But on the second deployment, there will be Hormagaunts with little gills and fins in amongst the, bobbing corpses of their drowned predecessors. Sometimes, if the Tyranid hive fleet is either of a particular persuasion or in a stretched situation, it might also place more import on the Hormagaunts by, say for example, increasing their speed or their lethality via the addition of bioacids. This is usually done if the fleet is a little bit desperate and it needs to increase the killing potential of its cheapest units, hoping that it can overrun the enemy fairly easily by adding a little bit more oomph to the initial wave. Though I do also feel it important to point out that the Hormagaunt isn't exactly harmless either. We're making it sound as if they exist purely just to be slaughtered en masse, and they do, and they are, but if they actually manage to get within stabbing range, then your average human soldier is going to have a very bad time. The Hormagaunt is not only extraordinarily fast, but it is absolutely unerringly viciously aggressive. It isn't going to flinch away from incoming fire, it isn't going to be scared off, you can't wave a bayonet at it and expect it to keep its range until you can reload or anything. It will simply hurl itself at you and start slicing. And due to the magics of the future, claws are really, really sharp. To the point where certain of them can cut through Terminator armor. But hey, details. The Hormagaunts can thus present a significant danger to your average Imperial Guard formation, and if it should be caught flat-footed and not dug in and in a prepared position, it's likely to be a pretty one-sided slaughter. Now, sure, the Guard will kill a lot more Hormagaunts than the Hormagaunts will kill Guardsmen, but that really genuinely does not matter. If the Tyranids can wipe out a regiment at the cost of 1 million Gaunts, that's a pretty damn good exchange right there. But it is also, yet again, impossible to get around the fact that a creature whose only means of offense is biting or clawing at someone is going to have a very hard and short life in a setting where your regular soldier is lugging around a fully automatic laser weapon with 200 rounds of ammunition in a tiny little box magazine. In an effort to ameliorate a bit of this weakness, the second form of Gaunt we're going to be talking about today, the Termagant, are equipped with a ranged weapon of their very own. Most usually the Flesh Borer, which is a pretty nasty little weapon that fires, well, as the name implies, flesh-eating beetles, and with a pretty damn high cycle rate as well. If one of these things hits you, well, the impact itself isn't going to be too problematic, but you now have a flesh-eating worm attached to your skin, and its only purpose in life is to burrow inside of your body and subsequently find something vital to chew on. I unironically think I'd rather be shot by a Dark Eldar splinter gun, frankly. But, weapon aside, the Termagants, although being superficially similar to the Hormagaunts, have a very different role, a very different behavioral pattern, and a very different purpose. They are still relatively cheap in terms of, biological matter that go into them, but they are significantly more expensive, again, even if these terms mean nothing really to the Hive Fleet, than the Hormagaunts. The weapon itself, the Flesh Borer, is a living creature, capable of birthing its own living creatures, and then pelting the enemy with them. Yeah, there's a lot of birthing and throwing babies at the enemy with the Tyranids. What can I say? It's just the way they are, okay? It's how it is. This, of course, means that they're going to need to carry a lot more genetic material, and thus become more, as we say, expensive. This means that they've got to be utilized far more effectively than the Hormagaunt, but nowhere near as effectively than warriors or carnifexes or anything like that. They are usually a part of the second wave deployment, or to act as heavier hitting elements of the initial first wave deployments. In this case, they will add additional firepower to the leading edges of the swarm, as warriors and some simple synapse creatures will be deployed alongside the Hormagaunts. They are the ones that identify the more vital targets and then direct the swarm's main strength towards them, where the Termagants are likely to be in the mix, where they provide a very valuable asset to the Hormagaunts, their little brethren. See, simply running towards the enemy lines screaming was proven to be a fairly ineffective strategy all the way back in, 1914, etc. However, running screaming towards the enemy whilst being covered by heavy machine gun fire is, while still largely suicidal, is marginally less so, and the Termagants fulfill the role of heavy machine gun, pumping out a truly ferocious quantity of little babies at the enemy with the hopes of keeping their heads down and thus not pumping lasgun fire into the approaching Hormagaunt hordes. And this support nature continues yet further. The Termagants are actually one of the relatively few Tyranid organisms that are active aboard the Tyranid fleet at all times, in smaller numbers to be sure, but still active, as they provide security to the larger hive ships. This is also done on the planet itself, with the Termagants providing, well, the Tyranid equivalent of realigned security, picking off anything that the Hormagaunts may have missed. Bearing in mind yet again that the Hormagaunts, whilst not under direct synapse control, are super predators, meaning that they're pretty good at hunting and they will do so very actively, but there are ways to trick wild animals, and the Hormagaunts are but wild animals. The Termagants are likely to be guided by at least a warrior, and thus will be able to draw upon significantly greater tactical knowledge, and the ability to hunt things down using clues that the Hormagants might miss, like, foot tracks, for example. Close coordination with warriors is also another defining feature of the Termagants, as they usually serve as bodyguard organisms to the warriors, in the same way that warriors often serve as bodyguard organisms to hive tyrants. The Termagants will react very protectively and aggressively whilst around their warrior masters. They will happily place themselves in the way of danger and incoming fire, and they will also very aggressively try to kill anything that's attempting to hurt their masters. This closer collaboration with synapse creatures also means that the Termagants become, whilst not an elite force by any stretch of the imagination, more elite than the chaff, being used far more surgically and effectively, usually therefore being part of second-line assaults. The Hormagaunts will attack something, die in one quantity or another, and the warriors will then be vectored in alongside Termagants to provide support to the second attack upon the target, attempting to overrun it with the additional element of some direct control from the warriors and the supporting fire from the Termagants. The Termagants also serve a secondary and rather fascinating purpose. Whereas if a Hormagant is left to its own devices, it will hunt down and kill anything it comes across, the Termagant will react in the exact opposite way. So imagine a scenario in which a brood of warriors is commanding a large swell of Hormagants and Termagants against an enemy defensive position. The assault fails. The Hormagants throw themselves at the defenses and are cut to pieces. The warrior itself is slain. Now the Termagants, instead of just assaulting the enemy, will instead scatter, as their instincts tell them to hide, to go to ground, to conceal themselves wherever they can, thus creating a huge area in front of the enemy's positions, essentially seeded with living monster landmines. Now, this may not initially sound all that impressive. Surely the enemy would simply hunker down, right, and wait for the next wave? Well, not necessarily. Bear in mind, once more, that the Hormagaunts' primary purpose is to locate centers of enemy resistance and, by doing so, begin pinning them in place via assaults. This is absolutely vital for the Tyranid hive fleet, because it wants to take over a planet and eat it with as little casualties as possible. And a very important component in doing so is, of course, being able to destroy the enemy piecemeal before it is allowed to gather up, abandon strategically unimportant areas, and all go to ground in an enormous F-off bunker line, which is going to cost a tremendous amount of biomass to overrun. The Hormagants can only, however, keep them pinned for so long until they all die. The Termagants, though, well, they'll scatter in the nearby area, meaning that if the enemy then attempts to move, whether it be retreat or advance or anything, there is a very good chance that they are going to have to carefully and slowly, most importantly, clear their path of ambushing little monsters before they can move. And due to the Termagants' superior, in most cases, senses, they make excellent ambush predators. Again, they're not going to have any grasp of tactics when they're hiding, so a well-organized assault upon them by a prepared enemy will be again a very one-sided affair. They have no way to react to, fragmentation grenades or flashbangs, or having their areas hosed down with flamers or pinned down by suppression fire, etc. A well-drilled and organized squad can kill a indefinite number of Termagants so long as they've got enough ammo with relatively little risk to themselves. But all of this will of course require time. The very resource that a horde of Termagants going to ground is designed to deprive you of. Again, clever little girls. It does strike me as noteworthy that GW appears to be far more capable of coming up with viable tactics for monsters than they do humanoids. Oh well, I suppose it takes one to know one, right? This cautious disposition also manifests itself in a few other ways. Almost as if mimicking their big brothers the warriors, the Termagants are possessed of far more cunning, is probably the correct word, more innate animal shrewdness than the Hormagaunts. This makes the Termagant capable of limited independent operations. Whereas the Hormagaunts are simply a blunt object hurled towards the enemy, Termagants can be ordered together and sent out on assault missions with at least a modicum of expectations that they're going to go about their objectives with a pinch of sophistication. Being ambush predators themselves, for example, they're quite good at spotting enemy troops lying in wait for them. They are also intelligent enough to attempt to circumvent the strongest portions of an enemy's defenses, trying instead to fall upon its flanks or rears, using their superior mobility to their advantage. They're still by no stretch of the imagination particularly tactically capable, however, and their acumen pretty much amounts to, oh, bad thing over there, hurty ow ow. Try to go around, if not worky, die. But it's something. It's more than the Hormagaunts could come up with. But perhaps not quite as much as the last and final creature could come up with, the Gargoyles. Now, the Gargoyle owes far more to the Termagant than it does the Hormagant, but although they are visually similar, I'm betting that the actual biological structure of the Gargoyle is significantly different to that of the Termagant, for the simple reason that, well, it flies. And on a pair of pretty small wings as well, so, the bones have got to be hollow at the very least, and it probably isn't going to have a whole lot of internal systems either, as, well, something of that size flying on thin, leathery bat wings is going to need to do quite a few shortcuts. though it is also possible that they simply have supercharged biologies like the Hormagants, that they burn their energy extraordinarily rapidly to beat their wings quickly enough to make up for their lack of specific design. This would seem like a complete and utter real waste of biofuel, really, but it's theoretically possible. And with the deployment of larger creatures like the Harridan, essentially acting as flying hangar ships for swarms of gargoyles, it is also a theoretical possibility, as they might then be able to refuel from their little flying carrier. Internal differences aside, though, the overall role of the gargoyle is similar, although not quite the same, as the Termagants. As the gargoyle is equipped with the very same flesh-borer weapon, it is primarily a ranged fighter, but it obviously has the advantage of elevation, which matters for quite a lot. The flesh-borer has a fairly high cycle rate, but a relatively limited range due to the fact that it uses a muscle that contracts and spits out the ammunition. This is obviously going to limit its range pretty damn severely, especially in comparison to energy weapons or good old-fashioned guns. And whilst the gargoyle's flesh-borer isn't any different, it can be fired from way, way, way up in the sky, giving it automatically better range. Though I will point out that the flesh-borer beetles themselves are not very heavy, or that is, they don't appear to be as such. They're probably, heavier than the average bullet, definitely, but they're also not very aerodynamic, so I'm wondering how their range would suffer over, well, extended trajectories, seeing as in this case we are, potentially lobbing the ammunition here. Without being able to weigh one, I guess we're not really going to get an answer to that question. But in theory, the gargoyles should have the ability to engage enemies at significantly greater range, if not in a straight line, then at the very least vertically, raining flesh-borer ammunition down on unsuspecting enemy troops. Though, again, they have a fairly low service ceiling, it appears, and the range of the flesh-borers is also limited by the fact that the living ammunition is going to start dying the moment it leaves its womb. So, if you fire it from too far up, well, the flesh-borers are simply going to be dead before they hit the ground. Meaning that they cannot simply, chill up in the clouds and rain death down upon the enemy. They will, almost universally, be forced into the range of enemy small arms fire to effectively engage. Which seems like a pretty significant design flaw in my opinion, but again, details. And to be fair to the flappy fella, the main purpose of gargoyles isn't really combat. Oh, they're plenty capable of it, and they will absolutely serve in that role when necessary, but their first task is as terror weapons and advanced scouts and harassing forces. Again, with the idea being to try and separate and drive the enemy away from another, or at the very least prevent them or hinder them from joining up. Obviously, having a bunch of flying horror creatures dumping flesh-eating beetles down upon your head is going to, dishearten your average trooper, not to mention the civilian populace, causing them all to flee out of their homes and onto the roads. Those vital arteries across which you really need to be moving some military hardware in the case of a major planetary invasion. Yes. That was a tactic that worked out pretty damn well in the Second World Kerfuffle back on Earth. And, as it so happens, the Tyrannids have stolen a note or two from the Goymans as well, as the gargoyles make loud screeching noises when they fire bioplasma from their maws. A terrifying sound indeed. And seeing as it's accompanied by acidic green vomit... fairly dangerous too. Thus, the Gargoyles will usually be deployed alongside the second wave assaults, roaming far ahead of the main horde, seeking out enemy civilian population centers, chasing the little bastards out into the open where they can be devoured by the Hormagants, which again aren't really that good at hide and seek, so a monster flying in the sky, flapping and screeching, etc., is a nice motivating factor to get people outdoors. Apparently. Personally, I'd hunker down, but hey, again, details indeed. And they will also launch harassing attack against enemy units on the move. And as large-scale military formations traversing terrain are likely to be stretched out for quite some distance, probably in a column, a horde of gargoyles can do some serious damage. Now, if they run face-first into a Hydra flak battery or something, they are going to disappear awfully quickly, because whilst the gargoyles themselves are still decently armoured by Tyranid standards, their flappy bat leather wings, they do not stand up very well to hypervelocity shrapnel. Indeed, any assault on a prepared enemy is likely to end in the absolute one-sided slaughter of our poor little flying fellas here. As even lasgun rounds, or hard rounds, or, hell, shotguns, will do significant damage to their mode of transportation, which wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that they were also, at the point in time, probably flying quite quickly and quite far up in the air. As a wise man once said, it isn't the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop. On the face of it then, the Gargoyles are not very good or well suited to attacking enemy positions. Unsupported, that is. But the Gargoyles are not supposed to do so either. Whereas the Termagants can attack centers of enemy resistance with a degree of hope and optimism, the Gargoyles don't really want to. They are harassing troops first and foremost. Only in the later stages of a Tyranid invasion, when most of the roving enemies have been pinned down or taken care of, will the Gargoyles be deployed alongside other forces to take on enemy primary strengths, where they fulfill two main roles. The first is obviously aerial support. Being able to pour fire down on the enemy from both above and below is obviously useful, and if the Termagants can provide Hormagants with supporting fire from the ground, then doubling up and doing it from the sky as well, whilst also providing yet another distraction with swooping gargoyles slashing at defenders or firing at them with their flesh borers, well, that's just ideal. And see, one of the main problems that the Tyranid horde often runs into is that there will be more Tyranids than there will be ground to cross, particularly if the enemy has intelligently positioned themselves in areas where they can't be easily flanked or attacked from behind, say in mountainous terrain or within prepared fortifications or a hive city. There are only so many approaches to these areas, and thus only so many Tyranids can attack at a time, unless of course you put the Tyranids in the sky, where there's bound to be a hell of a lot more room, allowing the Tyranid hive fleet to throw a lot more bodies at an objective. And the more bodies can be thrown, the greater the likelihood of some of those bodies actually reaching the people with the ranged weaponry. In addition to this more distracting task, the Gargoyles also have a specialized task when it comes to dealing with enemy fortifications. The Gargoyles do have synapse creatures like flying warriors or the aforementioned harridans as well, and are thus capable of sophisticated operations if led by one of these synapse creatures. But even without these, the natural instinct of the Gargoyle makes it seek out small and confined spaces like, chimneys and ventilation shafts, etc., which makes them excellent at infiltrating built-up areas like hives or fortified defense lines from above. Furthermore, the Gargoyles are hardwired to freak the F out when discovered and attacked in close confines. So if a gargoyle waffling through a ventilation shaft suddenly dumps down into a room full of enemy soldiers, it is going to transform into a frenzied ball of stabbing claws, biting jaws, slashing tails, flapping wings, etc. A damn good distraction, first and foremost, and also a really gosh darn dangerous ball of hyperactive horns and claws and talons in a confined space. A living hand grenade, in essence, just, less intelligent. And in and of itself, this isn't too dangerous. Oh, sure, it'll be an unfortunate surprise for the people in the room, definitely, but the majority of the gargoyles are probably going to be busy ramming themselves down vent heat piping and getting fried, or jumping into giant spinning blades passing air through the complexes, or something like that. The real benefit of having the gargoyles infiltrate areas is when they are also under simultaneous attack from Hormagants and Termagants and whatever else the hive is throwing at the position. Whereas a lone gargoyle dumping down into the toilet is a mild distraction and potentially a lethal one, if this happens during a major attack and gargoyles start popping out of ventilation shafts in primary fire control centers, now that's a catastrophe in the offing right there. And even if they don't find anything valuable to maul, they will require the enemy to yet again pull further guns away from the front lines and actively patrol the internals of their own positions. Of course, there are ways around this as well, like a aggressive anti-air defense policy, shooting anything the size of a bird that comes within half a kilometer of a hive city, which is also going to be a hefty expenditure of ammunition, mind you, as well. But it will serve as a powerful distraction. Even if the gargoyles never make it inside, even if they don't kill anybody, they are going to be fulfilling their purpose, at the very least in part. And again, they're certainly not harmless as assaulting troops either. If you need to break open an enemy trench line, for example, what better way to do so than to have a few thousand gargoyles sweep down upon it from up on high at near terminal velocity? There'll be very, very little, if any, warning that the attack is even happening until the gargoyles are in amongst the defenders. If then another mass stampede of Hormagants and Termagants was to start pouring out from their own defensive positions opposite the enemies, yep, shit's gonna get really complicated really quickly. That's the beauty of the Tyranid hive fleet. Whereas the individual bioorganisms might not be particularly impressive, once all deployed together with the perfect precision of a hive mind, oh yeah, that's scary. That makes even the least of the hive's creatures quite the threat. But I will wrap it up there. Hopefully you'll now have a bit of a better idea about Tyranid Gaunts and their primary variants, the Hormagaunts, the Termagants, and the Gargoyles. And do remember to check out Raid Shadow Legends, link in the description down below. Until next time, I've been Arch, thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.